Wyoming Territory, 1885. The wind was a constant sculptor, shaping the land and the men who dared to live on it. It smoothed the edges of the mountains until they looked like the worn teeth of some ancient beast and carved patience into the face of Caleb Blackwood. He stood on the porch of his ranch house, a solitary figure against the vast emptiness, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the steel blue sky met the ochre dust of the plains. For 5 years, this view had been his only constant companion, a silent witness to the quiet grief he tended like a bitter crop. His world was one of order and self-reliance, a fortress built of routine and hard labor. He rose before the sun, the chill of the morning air a familiar shock against his skin. He mended fences that seemed to stretch into eternity, his hands calloused and sure. He rode the boundaries of his land, the rhythm of his horse's gait a steady percussion against the silence. He had learned that solitude was a kind of armor. Attachments were the chinks in that armor, the vulnerabilities that let the pain in. His past had taught him that lesson with a brutality that had seared itself into his soul. The memory of a small hand in his, and a woman's laughter that used to echo in this very house, was a ghost he kept locked away in the deepest chambers of his heart. To remember was to invite a pain so profound it threatened to shatter the man he had painstakingly rebuilt from the ruins. He believed that a man survived alone because the wilderness, in its indifferent cruelty, took everything you loved. It took with sickness, with accident, with the simple grinding passage of time. To love something was to mark it for destruction. So he kept to himself, his interactions in the nearby town of redemption brief and practical. He was respected, even liked in a distant way, but no one truly knew him. They saw the competent rancher, the man whose word was his bond, but they did not see the hollow space inside him, the landscape of loss that mirrored the empty plains around him. The air was still for a moment, a rare pause in the wind's relentless monologue. And in that quiet he heard it, a faint, mournful cry that grew steadily into a chuffing, metallic roar. The 2 o'clock train. It was a sound that belonged to another world, a world of cities and crowds and hurried lives he had long since abandoned. For him, it was merely a clock, a marker of the day's passage. But today, the sound felt different. It was a premonition, a thin steel wire of sound that seemed to pull taut the very air he breathed, signaling a disruption to the unyielding order of his existence. He did not know why, but a sense of unease settled over him, as fine and pervasive as the dust that coated everything he owned. He turned his gaze from the mountains to the thin line of smoke rising miles away, a dark smudge against the perfect blue, and felt the first tremor of a world about to change. The train hissed to a stop at the Redemption Depot, a great iron beast sighing steam into the dry air. Dust, stirred by its arrival, swirled like golden phantoms across the splintered platform. From a window, Eleanor Vance watched the town reveal itself. It was smaller, starker than she had imagined from the descriptions in Mr. Sterling's letters. The single main street was a ribbon of churned dirt, flanked by false-fronted buildings that looked like they were holding their breath against the wind. It was a world of browns and grays, a stark contrast to the vibrant greens and stately brick of her Boston home. A flicker of doubt, cold and sharp, pierced the fragile hope she had carried with her across the continent. She stepped down from the carriage, her navy blue traveling suit, so practical and fashionable in the East, now seeming entirely out of place. It collected the dust instantly, the fine wool a magnet for the grit of this new world. Her honey-blonde hair was pinned neatly beneath a modest hat, but she felt as though every strand was an antenna, absorbing the unfamiliar sights, sounds, and smells. The scent of horse and leather, the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the low murmur of men's voices from the saloon. She clutched her valise, her knuckles white. Mr. Sterling had promised to meet her. His letters had been a lifeline, painting a picture of a respectable future, a chance to build a new life after the loss of her parents had left her adrift and alone. But the platform was emptying, and there was no sign of the kind, middle-aged gentleman whose photograph she carried in her locket. There was only a collection of leathery-faced men in dusty hats, a harried station master, and a few women in faded calico dresses who cast curious glances her way. Her carefully constructed composure began to fray at the edges. She was a solitary figure, a splash of deep blue in a sepia landscape, and her vulnerability felt as conspicuous as her attire. Panic, a cold and creeping vine, began to twist in her stomach. What if he was not coming? What if this had all been a terrible, foolish mistake? Caleb had ridden into town for supplies, a weekly ritual he performed with grim efficiency. He was tying his horse to the hitching post outside the general store when he saw her. She stood by the depot, a still point in the bustling chaos of the train's arrival. He had noticed her the moment she stepped onto the platform. She was like a bird of a different species, her colors too bright, her posture too refined for this rough-hewn corner of the world. He saw the elegant line of her neck, the determined set of her jaw, but also the flicker of anxiety in her eyes as she scanned the crowd. He recognized the look of someone who was lost, someone whose anchor had just been cut. His first instinct was to ignore it. It was not his concern. He had his own burdens to carry. He had no room for anyone else's. He turned toward the store, his jaw set. But then a man stepped forward to approach her. Caleb recognized him instantly. Arthur Sterling, a man whose slicked-back hair and overly eager smile did nothing to hide the avarice in his eyes. He was a clerk, a lackey for Silas Croft, the wealthiest and most ruthless cattle baron in the territory. Croft was a man who collected land and power the way other men collected stamps, and he cared little for who he crushed in the process. Sterling greeted the woman with a familiarity that was both effusive and false. He reached for her bags, his movements jerky and impatient. When he grabbed her valise, he pulled too hard, and she stumbled, her balance lost for a second. She collided with the hard wall of a man's chest, her gloved hand flying out to steady herself against a forearm as solid as oak. "Easy there," a low voice rumbled, the sound vibrating through her. Eleanor looked up. She found herself staring into the clearest, coldest gray eyes she had ever seen. They were the color of a winter sky, and they held a stillness that was both unnerving and strangely calming. The man was tall, his shoulders broad beneath a worn leather vest. His face was all angles and planes, weathered by sun and wind, and a dark stubble shadowed a jaw that looked like it had been carved from granite. He was holding her elbow, his grip firm but not rough, steadying her. For a moment, the world seemed to shrink to the space between them. The scent of leather and pine, the surprising warmth of his hand through her sleeve, the intensity of his gaze. Caleb felt the contact like a spark on dry tinder. He had not willingly touched another person in years, not beyond a handshake in a business deal. The feel of her, slight and yet solid, the faint scent of lavender that clung to her clothes, was an unexpected shock to his system. He saw the flash of alarm, then surprise, in her deep blue eyes. He released her elbow as if it had burned him and took a half-step back, re-establishing the distance he so carefully maintained. "My apologies, Mr. Sterling," Eleanor said, her voice regaining its composure, though a faint blush colored her cheeks. "I seem to have lost my footing no matter, my dear," Sterling said, his smile not reaching his eyes. He shot a venomous look at Caleb. The local help can be a bit solid. Caleb's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. He simply met Sterling's gaze, his expression unreadable, and held it until Sterling looked away, flustered. Caleb gave a curt nod to Eleanor, a gesture that was neither friendly nor unfriendly, merely an acknowledgement. Then he turned and walked into the general store, the bell above the door jangling in his wake. But even as he began his list of flour, salt, and coffee, the memory of her startled blue eyes and the faint scent of lavender lingered, an unwelcome and unsettling disruption. Outside, Sterling's veneer of charm was already cracking. "Come, Eleanor," he said, his tone more commanding than inviting. "Mr. Croft is expecting us. We have much to discuss about our arrangement." The word hung in the air, heavy and unpleasant. As he led her toward a waiting buggy, Eleanor cast one last glance at the general store's door. The brief, unexpected moment of contact with a stranger had left an imprint, a fleeting sense of solidity in a world that was rapidly turning to quicksand beneath her feet. The meeting with Silas Croft was a nightmare cloaked in civility. Croft's office was opulent, a monument to wealth in the heart of a town defined by scarcity. Mahogany desk, leather chairs, a thick rug that muffled the sound of Eleanor's world collapsing. Croft was a large man, his bulk filling his chair, his eyes small and shrewd. He explained the arrangement with brutal clarity. Arthur Sterling was not the man she was to marry. He was merely an employee. The real arrangement was with Croft himself. "You see, Miss Vance," Croft explained, steepling his thick fingers, "your late father, in a moment of poor judgment, invested heavily in one of my less successful mining ventures. He left behind a considerable debt, a debt I now hold." He let the words sink in. "However, you also inherited a rather valuable piece of land back east. A marriage to my associate, Mr. Sterling, would see that land transferred into his name, and by extension, into my possession. The debt would be forgiven. You would be provided for, of course. A small house in town. A respectable allowance." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. The kind letters, the promises of a new life, had all been a lie. A carefully constructed trap. She was not a prospective bride. She was a commodity, a piece of property to be traded for another. "You deceived me," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and fury. "I provided you with an opportunity," Croft corrected smoothly. "A way out of a difficult situation. Frankly, a woman in your position has few options." Something inside Eleanor, a core of iron resilience she had inherited from her mother, refused to break. She rose to her feet, her posture ramrod straight. "I will not be a party to this deception. I will not marry Mr. Sterling, and I will not sign over my property. I will find a way to honor my father's debt myself." Croft's smile was a thin, predatory line. "A commendable sentiment, but naive. You are alone here, Miss Vance. You have no money, no friends. Where will you go? What will you do? The train back east does not leave for another week. Think carefully. Redemption could be a very unforgiving place for a woman on her own." His threat was veiled, but the menace was clear. Shaking but resolute, Eleanor turned and walked out of the office, leaving Sterling sputtering and Croft watching her with cold amusement. She stepped back out into the harsh sunlight of the main street, her heart pounding. Croft was right. She was utterly alone, stranded in a strange and hostile land with nothing but the clothes on her back and a valise filled with useless finery. The hope that had carried her across the country had crumbled to dust. Caleb finished his business and was loading his supplies into his wagon when he saw her emerge from Croft's office. He saw the pallor of her skin, the rigid set of her shoulders, the way she clutched her bag as if it were a shield. He saw Sterling hurry after her, trying to reason with her, his hands gesturing wildly. She shook her head, her words inaudible but her meaning clear, and walked away from him, her steps determined but aimless. She was a ship without a rudder, cast adrift in a dangerous sea. The code he lived by was simple: mind your own business. Do not get involved. But watching her, so clearly in distress, a forgotten instinct stirred within him. It was the same instinct that made him pull a calf from a mire or stand between a wolf and his herd. It was the instinct to protect something that could not protect itself. He cursed under his breath, angry at her for being there, angry at himself for caring. But he could not turn away. He untied his horse, his movements decisive, and walked it toward her, the quiet clip-clop of hooves on the dusty street announcing his approach. He was getting involved, and he knew, with a certainty that settled like a stone in his gut, that his world of solitude was about to be breached. He found her standing near the edge of town, staring out at the unforgiving plains as if she could will a path to safety to appear in the dust. She did not seem to hear him approach until his shadow fell over her. "Miss Vance," he said. His voice was low and even, betraying none of the internal conflict raging within him. She started, turning to face him. Up close, he could see the sheen of unshed tears in her eyes. though her expression was defiant. "I do not believe we have been formally introduced," she said, her voice strained but her Bostonian propriety firmly in place. "Caleb Blackwood," he supplied, touching the brim of his hat. "I saw you leaving Croft's office. It looked like you had received some bad news." It was a clumsy attempt at diplomacy, but it was the best he could manage. Her composure finally cracked. A single tear escaped and traced a clean path through the dust on her cheek. "You could say that," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "It seems my entire journey has been based on a lie. I find myself stranded." Caleb's mind worked quickly, pragmatically. He knew Croft. The man would not let this go. He would harass her, intimidate her, until she gave in. Leaving her alone in the town's only hotel was not an option. Croft practically owned the place. An image flashed in his mind of this woman, with her refined grace and hidden strength, being broken by Croft's relentless greed. The thought was intolerable. "You cannot stay in town," he stated, not as a suggestion, but as a fact. "It is not safe for you." He hesitated, the next words feeling foreign and heavy on his tongue. "My ranch is 5 miles out. I have a housekeeper, Martha. She is a good woman. You would be safe there until the next train arrives." Eleanor stared at him, stunned by the offer. He was a complete stranger, a man of few words and an intimidating presence. Yet his eyes, for all their coldness, held a surprising depth, a flicker of something honorable. She looked from his stoic face to the vast, empty land stretching behind him. Her choices were to trust this silent, imposing man or face the predatory machinations of Silas Croft alone. It was no choice at all. "Why would you do this for me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "You do not know me." Caleb's gaze shifted to the distant mountains. "No one should be at the mercy of a man like Croft," he said simply. He looked back at her, his expression unreadable. "My housekeeper will see to your needs. It is a practical solution to a temporary problem." He framed it as a transaction, stripping the offer of any sentiment. It was safer that way. Eleanor searched his face for any sign of duplicity, any hint of the trap she had just escaped. She found none. There was only a quiet strength, a sense of deep-rooted integrity. She took a breath, the dry air stinging her lungs, and made her decision. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood. I accept your offer." He nodded once, as if the matter were settled. "Get your things. I will bring the wagon around." He walked away without another word, leaving Eleanor to grapple with the dizzying turn her life had taken. In the space of a single afternoon, she had gone from prospective bride to penniless outcast, and now, the ward of a reclusive rancher whose name she had only just learned. As she watched his broad back recede, she felt a sliver of hope return. It was a fragile, tentative thing, but in the desolate landscape of her current circumstances, it felt as bright and precious as a star in the vast, dark sky. The ride to the ranch was conducted in a near-complete silence, broken only by the rhythmic creaking of the wagon wheels and the soft snort of the horses. Eleanor sat stiffly on the hard-wooden bench, her hands folded in her lap, acutely aware of the man beside her. He handled the reins with an economy of movement that spoke of long familiarity. His profile was stark against the setting sun, his silence as vast and profound as the landscape they moved through. She found herself studying him, noticing the way his eyes constantly scanned the horizon, the faint lines of sorrow etched around his mouth, the quiet competence in his scarred hands. He was a puzzle, a man who offered sanctuary but kept himself locked away behind impenetrable walls. Caleb was just as aware of her. Her presence was a disruption to the very air in his wagon. He could feel her unease, her quiet dignity. He had spent years cultivating his solitude, and now a woman who smelled of lavender and carried the weight of a different world sat beside him. He felt a primal urge to protect her, and an equally strong urge to push her away, to preserve the sterile peace of his isolation. The two impulses warred within him, creating a tension that tightened the muscles in his jaw. The ranch house came into view as the sun began to bleed orange and purple across the sky. It was a sturdy, simple structure made of dark timber, with a wide porch and stone chimney. It looked solid, rooted in the earth, a fortress against the wilderness. Smoke curled from the chimney, a welcoming plume against the darkening sky. As they pulled up, an older woman with graying hair pulled into a tight bun, and a no-nonsense expression came out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. "Caleb," she said, her voice warm but laced with curiosity as her eyes fell on Eleanor. "I was beginning to wonder." "Martha, this is Miss Eleanor Vance," Caleb said, climbing down from the wagon. "She'll be staying with us for a time. She needs a room." Martha's sharp eyes took in Eleanor's fine but dusty clothes, the exhaustion in her face, and the subtle way Caleb stood, as if positioning himself between her and the rest of the world. Martha had been with Caleb for years, had known his first wife. Sarah had witnessed the light go out of him after she and their son were taken by the fever. She understood him in a way few people did. She saw this unexpected act of charity for what it was, the first crack in the ice he had allowed to form around his heart. "Of course," Martha said, her expression softening. She came down the steps and offered Eleanor a warm, work-roughened hand. "Welcome, my dear. Do not you worry about a thing. You look tired from your journey. Come inside. I have a stew on the stove." Her kindness was so simple and genuine that Eleanor felt the tight knot of fear in her chest begin to loosen. The days that followed fell into a strange, quiet rhythm. Martha, with her gruff tenderness, became Eleanor's anchor. She showed her the small, immaculately clean guest room that would be hers, with its simple pine bed and a window that looked out onto the endless expanse of the prairie. She was a source of practical wisdom and unspoken sympathy. Caleb remained a distant, formidable presence. He was gone before Eleanor woke, and he often returned long after the sun had set, his face grim with fatigue. Their interactions were minimal, polite exchanges over the dinner table. He would ask if she was comfortable, and she would reply that she was, thanking him again for his hospitality. The air between them was thick with things unsaid. She was a guest, a problem he had taken on, and he seemed determined to keep it that way. But Eleanor was not one to sit idle. She could not repay his kindness with coin, so she was determined to repay it with work. She began to help Martha in the kitchen, her delicate hands, accustomed to needlepoint and piano keys, learning the more robust skills of kneading dough and plucking chickens. She helped in the garden, feeling the sun on her back and the rich soil under her fingernails. The work was grounding, a way to reclaim a sense of purpose. Caleb began to notice the changes. He would come home to the scent of freshly baked bread, a scent he had not smelled in his house for 5 years. He saw her in the garden, a smudge of dirt on her cheek, her brow furrowed in concentration as she weeded around the stubborn vegetable plants. He saw a resilience in her he had not expected. She was not the fragile city flower he had first assumed. There was a strength in her, a quiet determination that earned his grudging respect. He found himself watching her, his observations growing longer, more frequent. He was drawn to the contrast of her, the way her refined speech sounded against the rustic backdrop of his home, the grace in her movements even when she was performing the most menial of tasks. One evening, a storm rolled in, one of those violent, sudden prairie squalls that turned the sky to a bruised purple. The wind howled around the house, and rain lashed against the windows. The three of them were gathered in the main room, the fire in the stone hearth casting flickering shadows on the walls. Martha was knitting, her needles clicking a steady rhythm against the storm's fury. Caleb was cleaning a rifle, his movements precise and methodical. Eleanor sat with a book, but she could not concentrate. The silence stretched, filled only by the storm and the fire. Finally, Eleanor closed her book. "Mr. Blackwood," she began, her voice soft. "I have been here for almost a week. I cannot impose on your generosity indefinitely. I must find some kind of work in town." Caleb did not look up from his task. "There is no work in town for a woman like you, and it is not safe. Croft will be watching, waiting." His tone was flat, dismissive. "Then what am I to do?" she asked, a note of desperation creeping into her voice. "I cannot simply be a burden to you." He finally looked at her, his gray eyes catching the firelight. "You are not a burden. The words were spoken so quietly she almost missed them. He seemed surprised to have said them himself. A log in the fire popped, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. The intimate, enclosed space seemed to encourage a confidence that the wide-open days did not. "You lost someone," Eleanor said, the words an observation, not a question. In this house, Caleb's hand stilled. The air grew heavy. Martha stopped her knitting, her gaze fixed on the fire. He looked at Eleanor, his expression hardening, his walls flying back up. "That is none of your concern. I am sorry," she said quickly, chastened. "That was presumptuous of me. It is just, there's a sadness here. A deep one. I know what that feels like. I lost both my parents last year, within months of each other. That is why I was so foolish as to believe Mr. Sterling's promises. I was alone, and I was looking for a home." Her confession was simple, unadorned, and it pierced through his defenses. He saw not an intruder prying into his grief, but a fellow traveler in the barren land of loss. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw the echo of his own pain in her eyes. He set the rifle aside and leaned forward, his forearms resting on his knees. The firelight carved deep shadows into his face. "My wife, Sarah," he said, the name a rusty key turning a lock that had not been opened for years. "And our son, Daniel. He was 4. The fever came through 3 winters ago. It was fast. There was nothing the doctor could do." He spoke in short, clipped sentences, as if each word was a stone he had to dredge up from the bottom of a deep, cold well. This house was full of her laughter. "Daniel," he used to run through this room, pretending he was a wild stallion. He fell silent, his gaze lost in the flames. Eleanor's heart ached for him. She could feel the crushing weight of his loss, the emptiness that he had tried to fill with work and silence. "I am so sorry, Caleb," she said, using his first name for the first time. It felt natural, right? He looked up, and for the first time, the icy shield in his eyes was gone. In its place was a raw, unguarded vulnerability that took her breath away. It was a moment of profound connection, a silent acknowledgement of their shared humanity, their shared experience of grief. In the heart of the storm, surrounded by the warmth of the fire, 2 lonely souls had found a moment of common ground. The first true bond had been formed, not of words, but of the quiet, powerful language of shared sorrow. And for Caleb, the fortress of his solitude, which had seemed so impenetrable, now had a gate that had been gently, irrevocably pushed open. The truce born of shared vulnerability did not last. The following morning, Caleb was once again distant, his manner even more brusque than before. The moment of intimacy by the fire had unnerved him. He had revealed a part of himself he had kept hidden for years, and the exposure felt dangerous. He retreated back into his shell of silence, throwing himself into his work with a renewed ferocity, as if he could physically outrun the feelings Eleanor had stirred in him. Eleanor felt the shift immediately. The fragile bridge they had built the night before had been washed away. His withdrawal was a palpable thing, a cold draft in the house. It hurt more than she would have admitted. She had seen the man beneath the armor, and the glimpse had made her long for more. She resolved to be patient, to give him the space he so clearly needed, but a seed of disappointment had taken root in her heart. Meanwhile, Silas Croft was not a man to be trifled with. He had been humiliated by Eleanor's public refusal and angered by Caleb Blackwood's interference. Blackwood's ranch, with its prime location on the only year-round creek in the valley, was a property Croft had coveted for years. Now, Blackwood was not only defying him, but was also harboring the key to a significant financial acquisition. Croft's greed and his pride demanded action. The first sign of trouble came in town. When Caleb went for his weekly supplies, he found the atmosphere had changed. Men who used to greet him with a nod now averted their eyes. The store owner was nervous, his hands trembling as he measured out the flour. "There is talk, Caleb," the old man, Mr. Henderson, muttered, keeping his voice low. "Croft has been putting the word out. He is saying you abducted Miss Vance. That you are holding her against her." Will Caleb's jaw tightened. "That is a lie. I know it is," Henderson said, glancing nervously toward the door. But Croft pays a lot of bills in this town. People are afraid to cross him. Sheriff Brody is doing what he can, but he is just one man. Be careful, Caleb. Croft has hired some new hands. They are not the usual sort of cowboys. Caleb's conversation with Sheriff Brody confirmed his fears. They are hired guns, Caleb, Brody said, his face grim. He was a good man, a friend, but his authority was limited. I ran one of them out of Kansas a few years back. They're trouble. Croft is making a play for your land, and he is using the girl as his excuse. He is trying to paint you as a villain to justify whatever he is planning. The threat was no longer abstract. It had a face and a name. When Caleb returned to the ranch, he carried a new tension with him. He began carrying his rifle wherever he went, his eyes constantly scanning the ridges and hollows of his property. He was on high alert, a sentinel guarding his small kingdom. The confrontation escalated a few days later. Caleb discovered that the creek flowing through his property had been dammed upstream. A crude barrier of rocks and logs had reduced the life-giving flow of water to a mere trickle. It was a direct assault on his livelihood, a clear and unambiguous threat. It was Croft's way of saying, I can take whatever I want. Fury, cold and hard, settled in Caleb's chest. He spent the entire day dismantling the dam, his muscles straining, his anger a hot coal in his gut. He knew this was just the beginning. Croft was testing him, tightening the screws. Eleanor, feeling useless and confined to the house, grew restless. She needed to feel the sun, to breathe air that was not thick with unspoken tension. Against Martha's advice, she decided to go for a walk, promising to stay within sight of the house. She followed a game trail that led into a small copse of aspen trees, their leaves shimmering like golden coins in the afternoon light. The quiet beauty of the place soothed her frayed nerves. She did not hear them until it was too late. Two men on horseback emerged from the trees, blocking her path. One was Arthur Sterling, his face a mask of smug triumph. The other was a hard-faced man with cold, dead eyes that made her skin crawl. Miss Vance, Sterling said, his voice dripping with false concern. We were so worried about you. Mr. Blackwood has been telling everyone such terrible lies. We have come to rescue you. Eleanor's blood ran cold. I do not need rescuing, she said, her voice shaking but firm. She started to back away. The second man dismounted, his movements quick and predatory. Mr. Croft wants to see you, miss. He insists. He lunged for her. Eleanor screamed and tried to run, but he was too fast. He grabbed her arm, his fingers biting into her flesh like a vice. She struggled, kicking and twisting, her heart hammering against her ribs. The sound of her scream, thin and desperate, carried on the wind. Caleb was riding back from a destroyed dam when he heard it. Adrenaline shot through him like a lightning strike. He spurred his horse, galloping toward the sound, his rifle already in his hand. He burst into the clearing to see Eleanor struggling against the hired gun, while Sterling watched from his horse with a cruel smile. The sight of that man's hands on her, of the terror in her eyes, unleashed something primal in Caleb. The cold, controlled anger he had been nursing for days erupted into a white-hot rage. Get your hands off her, he roared, his voice the crack of doom. The man holding Eleanor shoved her to the ground and drew his pistol. But Caleb was faster. He was already off his horse, his rifle at his shoulder. A single shot rang out, deafening in the quiet grove. The hired gun cried out and crumpled to the ground, clutching a shattered shoulder. Sterling, his face ashen with terror, fumbled for his own weapon. Caleb did not even glance at him. He strode forward, grabbed the front of Sterling's expensive coat, and hauled him from the saddle. He slammed him against the trunk of an aspen, the impact knocking the air from Sterling's lungs. If you or any of Croft's men ever come near her again, Caleb snarled, his face inches from Sterling's, his gray eyes blazing with a terrifying fire. I will not aim for the shoulder. Do you understand me? Sterling could only nod, his eyes wide with fear. Go back to your master, Caleb said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. Tell him this is my land, and she is under my protection. Tell him to stay away. He released Sterling, shoving him toward his horse. Sterling scrambled into the saddle and fled, not even sparing a glance for his wounded companion. Caleb turned his attention to the man on the ground, who was groaning in pain. He kicked the pistol away from the man's reach. "Get on your horse and ride out of here before I change my mind." The man, clutching his arm, staggered to his feet and managed to haul himself onto his horse, quickly following Sterling. The clearing was suddenly silent again, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder. Caleb's rage receded, leaving him shaken. He turned to Eleanor. She was still on the ground, her dress torn, her face pale. He rushed to her side, his heart pounding with a fear he had not felt in years. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. He knelt beside her, his hands hovering, unsure of how to touch her. She looked up at him, her eyes wide and luminous. She saw not the cold, distant rancher, but a fierce protector, a man who had faced down violence for her sake. Without thinking, she launched herself into his arms, burying her face in his chest, her body trembling with reaction. The impact of her embrace stunned him. For a moment, he remained rigid, his arms frozen at his sides. Then, slowly, tentatively, his arms came around her, pulling her close. He held her against him, feeling the frantic beat of her heart against his own. He rested his cheek against the top of her head, breathing in the scent of her hair. In that moment, holding her, feeling her tangible, living warmth, he understood a terrifying truth. His carefully constructed walls had not just been breached, they had been utterly demolished. His belief in solitude, his conviction that attachment was a weakness, shattered like glass against stone. He was protecting more than just a guest. He was protecting the woman who had, against all his will, found her way into the desolate, empty rooms of his heart. And the fear of losing her was 1,000 times more potent than the dull ache of his old grief. The aftermath of the attack settled over the ranch like a shroud. A new, heavier silence replaced the old one. It was no longer the silence of emotional distance, but the tense, watchful quiet of impending battle. Caleb was a changed man. The fierce protectiveness he had displayed in the aspen grove did not recede with his anger. It was now a permanent part of his bearing. He patrolled the ranch,